Okay, so you've sent us a ton of stuff about crisis intervention in schools and how schools respond when something really bad happens.
Yeah.
So let's jump right in
Okay.
and do a deep dive on psychological debriefing
Yeah.
and things like that, especially when we're talking about schools.
Right.
I think our main goal here is to get to the bottom,
Yeah.
whether these early interventions like CISD and CSMM and psychological debriefing, which is sometimes just called PD, are actually effective in schools.
No, right. I mean, that's the big question, especially when we're talking about supporting young people during, these really tough times when they're facing a crisis. It's actually kind of fascinating when you look back at where these ideas even came from.
Okay, so like the history of this stuff.
Yeah, like the concept of psychological debriefing actually goes way back, like all the way back to World War I. They were using it with soldiers back then.
Wow, really?
To try and boost their morale and, help them cope with the trauma of war so they could return to duty.
So it was really focused on getting them back out there, fighting. Very different from like what we're thinking about in a school setting.
Oh, completely different context. It's
Yeah.
interesting to see how it evolved.
So how did we get from World War I soldiers to what we see today in schools when a crisis happens?
So in the early 1980s, this guy named Mitchell came up with something called CISD, which stands for Critical Incident Stress Debriefing. And it was specifically designed for first responders, like emergency service workers who deal with traumatic events on a regular basis.
Makes sense, right? Like firefighters and paramedics, those folks.
Exactly. And it's a very structured process. It's got 7 phases. So it starts with like an introduction, then they establish the facts of what happened.
Like the timeline of the event.
Yeah, exactly. Then they get into the individual's thoughts and impressions and their emotional reactions. And then it moves into this phase where they try to normalize those feelings, let them know it's okay to feel that way.
Right.
Given what they've been through, then they do some future planning, and then there's a disengagement phase.
It's a very step-by-step.
Yeah.
Very detailed. And then that kind of morphed into CISM, right?
Right. In the 90s, CSMM came along to broaden the scope. So think of critical incident stress management, or CSMM as the umbrella term, and CISD just became one technique under that larger umbrella.
Okay.
Which makes sense because CSMM includes a whole bunch of other things like pre-crisis training, big group interventions like they do with demobilizations after a major event, defusing, which is kind of like a shorter, less formal version of debriefing that happens right away.
Oh, I see.
CISD itself, then individual and family crisis intervention, follow-up support.
So it's like a whole system, not just one thing.
Exactly, a whole system of support. And the interesting thing is it's not just for those first responders anymore, right? Like you said, it's spread to all kinds of settings.
It really has. And schools especially seem to have adopted it in a big way.
Yeah, absolutely.
The research you sent mentioned examples all across the U.S., Alaska, California, Virginia, New York. And even in Canada, it's the same thing. Ministries of education in places like Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia are actually recommending or providing training in CISD as part of how schools respond to a traumatic event.
I mean, it's
clearly seems like the go-to.
the standard.
The standard.
Right.
And it makes sense if you think about it, because initially the idea was that these interventions, they were a safe way to help people, like really reduce the immediate distress they're feeling after a traumatic event.
Oh.
And the hope was that it would also reduce their chances of developing PTSD later on.
Yeah, it sounds logical, right?
It does, right? Like a very proactive step.
Yeah.
But the research you shared with us paints a little bit of a different picture, doesn't it?
It does. That's kind of the heart of the issue, right? Like the research is suggesting that the evidence for how well CISD, CSM, and psychological debriefing actually work might not be as strong as everyone initially thought. And there's even some stuff that suggests there might be some downsides, that it might even make things worse for some people.
Oh, wow. That's kind of scary considering how widely it's used in schools.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we really need to unpack today. What does the research actually say about whether these methods are effective and safe, specifically in schools?
Right, and especially for kids.
So let's cut to the chase. After all this research, all these reviews and meta-analyses, what's the bottom line?
Okay, so when you look at all these really thorough studies, including the really rigorous Cochrane reviews, they're all saying pretty much the same thing. When it comes to preventing PTSD or reducing psychological distress in adults who've gone through something traumatic, doing a single session psychological debriefing or even multiple sessions of these early psychological interventions, they're generally just not effective.
So not effective.
Not really, no.
And then you mentioned the possibility of harm,
Right.
which is obviously a huge concern. Can you break that down for us a little bit more?
Yeah, so unfortunately, some of the studies have actually shown that people who got psychological debriefing after a trauma ended up with worse PTSD symptoms later on compared to those who didn't have the intervention. It's pretty alarming.
So they were actually worse off.
Yeah, in some cases, it seemed like the debriefing might have actually made things worse. And there's this researcher named Lillian Feld. He's kind of a big deal in this field, and he actually classifies CISD as a level 1 potentially harmful therapy.
Wow, that's a serious label.
It is, and it's based on multiple studies, randomized controlled trials, that has shown a probable risk of increased PTSD symptoms for at least some people who have this intervention.
I mean, that really makes you wonder why it became so popular in the first place, right?
Yeah.
But let's zero in on schools now, because that's what we're really interested in. What does the research say specifically about kids and teenagers when it comes to using these interventions?
So this is where things get even more, I guess, concerning, given how often these methods are used in schools, because there just isn't that much research that's looked at it specifically in school settings. Like the people who wrote one of the Cochrane reviews, they actually said that they couldn't find any good evidence about debriefing with kids and teens. And when we were looking at all the research for this deep dive, we found a bunch of papers about how schools create crisis intervention policies and like case examples of using CISD and stuff after events like student suicides. But not a lot of really rigorous studies, like randomized controlled trials, that actually looked at if it works in this age group.
So a lot of people talking about doing it, but not a lot of solid science to back it up.
Exactly.
Well, what about that study? The U.S. Task Force on Community Preventive Services looked at, I think it involved kids and teenagers after car accidents, right?
Yeah, that's a really important one because it's one of the few that looked at younger people. So the U.S. Task Force on Community Preventive Services, they found this one study that fit their criteria. And it looked at CISD after car accidents that involved kids and teenagers. What they found was that both groups, the kids who got the debriefing and the kids who didn't, they all showed a lot of improvement over time. But here's the key thing. The debriefing didn't really help any more than just the natural recovery process.
So no added benefit.
Nope, it didn't seem to provide any extra help.
So it really sounds like the evidence for using these interventions routinely in schools just isn't very strong.
Right. Especially with kids and teens, there's just not enough evidence to say it's helpful.
But I have to bring up something. The research paper mentioned that there is some literature out there that does support the effectiveness of CISD and CSM, at least for adults. So how do we make sense of these kind of conflicting findings?
Right, so that's a really important point to clarify because it can get confusing when you see studies that seem to contradict each other. And this is where it gets into the nitty-gritty of research methods, right? So there are some meta-analyses out there that do say PD, CISD, and CSM are effective in reducing distress in adults. And sometimes they report like medium to large effects, which makes it sound pretty good. But those particular meta-analyses, they've been criticized by other researchers for having some pretty big problems with how they were done.
Okay, so what kind of problems are we talking about here? Why are those seemingly positive findings not as reliable?
So there are several key issues. One is that a lot of the studies that were included in those more positive meta-analyses, they weren't even included in those super rigorous Cochrane reviews or other independent meta-analyses, which is already a red flag. And then there have been cases where researchers have tried to find some of the studies that were cited.
Like to double check the findings.
Exactly, but they couldn't find them. And then even when they could find the data, they couldn't replicate the findings. They couldn't get the same results when they analyzed it themselves.
Which is, I mean, that's not good, right?
No, it's a big problem. And then more broadly, the design of many of those studies that found positive effects just wasn't that great. They didn't have proper control groups. They didn't randomly assign people to the intervention or not.
So it makes it really hard to say if the intervention was really making the difference or if it was something else.
Exactly. And a lot of them didn't assess people before the debriefing to get a baseline of how distressed they were. So it's hard to tell if any changes they saw were actually because of the debriefing or just because time was passing, you know?
Right, right.
And then some studies didn't even clearly describe what kind of debriefing they used, when it took place, whether it was individual or group.
So, like, were they all actually doing the same thing?
Yeah, that's a good question that those studies don't always answer. And then on top of all that, a lot of those studies only followed people for a short time. So we don't know about the long-term effects.
That sounds like there are a lot of holes in that research.
Yeah, definitely some limitations.
And the paper also pointed out that those positive meta-analyses, They didn't even really look at whether people develop PTSD or other mental health problems.
Yeah, that's a big one.
So even though they might have found that people felt less distressed right after the debriefing, they didn't actually show that it prevented any long-term problems.
Exactly. It's really important to keep that in mind.
So we've got all these concerns about the research methods used in those studies that showed positive effects. And then there's also the fact that some of those researchers who found positive results, they're actually involved in developing and promoting CISD and CSM, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that raises some eyebrows.
Right. It's like, it can be hard to stay objective when you're so invested in something.
Yeah, it makes you wonder about potential bias. Okay, so it sounds like the evidence is leaning pretty heavily against the effectiveness of these debriefings, especially when we're talking about preventing PTSD, and then we have the potential for harm. What are the possible explanations for this?
So the research suggests a few things. One idea is that these really intense interventions right after a traumatic event, they might actually disrupt the natural healing process. Like our brains have their own ways of processing and integrating difficult experiences.
Right, like it takes time to process things.
Right, exactly. It's a complex process that involves memories and how we retrieve them, forcing people to go back and relive the trauma in such detail so soon. It might mess with that natural process. There was one review that said professionals might have misinterpreted survivors' initial reluctance to talk about what happened.
Like thinking they're avoiding it, which is bad.
Right. They thought it was unhealthy avoidance, but it might have actually been a natural and adaptive way of pacing their own recovery.
Like giving themselves the space they need.
Exactly. It's kind of like if you have a physical injury. Sometimes you need first aid right away, but then your body needs time to heal. And rushing into intense treatment too soon might actually make things worse.
Yeah, like if you pick at a scab before it's ready to come off.
Exactly. It's similar with psychological trauma. Sometimes people need time and space to process things at their own pace.
And it's interesting, too, because you mentioned earlier that most people who go through trauma, they don't actually seek out professional help, which kind of supports this idea of natural processing, right?
Yeah, that's another piece of the puzzle. The research shows that only a small percentage of people who go through trauma actually end up seeing a therapist, which suggests that for most people, their own coping mechanisms, taking time to process things bit by bit while still going about their lives, are enough for them to recover.
It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like maybe we've been too quick to assume that everyone needs this intense intervention right away.
It's possible. And there's also the concern that these early debriefing sessions, they might be overwhelming for some people or even re-traumatizing because they're being made to relive everything when they might not be ready to handle it. Plus, the memories of traumatic events naturally fade over time for a lot of people. But repeatedly going over them right after they happen might actually prevent that natural fading from happening.
So it's almost like it keeps the trauma fresh in their minds when they would have naturally started to heal.
Right. That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so we've got a lot of evidence suggesting that these interventions might not be that helpful and maybe even harmful. But schools are still using them all the time.
Yeah, it is a bit of a disconnect.
And it's not just us saying this. The Interagency Standing Committee of the United Nations, which is a pretty big deal in terms of humanitarian guidelines, they don't recommend single-session debriefing for people after major crises anymore.
Yeah, that's a pretty big shift.
It is a big shift, and it's because the evidence just isn't there to support it. So if these interventions aren't the answer, what does the research say schools should be doing instead to help their students and staff after something traumatic happens?
So the research actually points to some core principles that have been shown to help people after trauma, like promoting a sense of safety and security, fostering calm and emotional regulation, encouraging people to feel like they can cope and work together as a community, that sense of self-efficacy and community efficacy, promoting connection and social support, and fostering hope for the future. These are the things that seem to really help people recover.
Those make a lot of sense. They're like the foundation for healing.
Yeah, exactly. It's about creating the conditions for people to heal naturally.
And that's where psychological first aid comes in, right?
Yes, psychological first aid, or PFA, it's a much more evidence-informed approach, although it's important to note that it still needs more research, more large-scale studies, to really confirm its effectiveness. But the focus of PFA is on providing immediate support and comfort, making sure people feel safe, helping them connect with others, providing good information, and helping them develop healthy coping strategies. And it's flexible, So it can be delivered directly to students by trained professionals, or we can teach parents and caregivers PFA skills so they can support their kids.
I remember that table in the research paper. It outlined those core actions of PFA.
Yeah, it's really helpful.
Can you give us a few real-world examples of what PFA might actually look like in a school?
Yeah, for sure. So one core action is safety and comfort. In a school, that could mean making sure everyone is physically safe, communicating clearly about any risks, and creating an environment where students and staff feel emotionally safe too.
So like a sense of security and stability.
Exactly. A really practical example could be setting up a quiet space or a calm room
Right.
where students and teachers can go if they need a break, a place to just chill out and regulate their emotions after a stressful event.
Yeah, like a safe haven.
Exactly. And then another key action is connection with social supports. So in a school, that could mean helping students get in touch with their parents or caregivers,
Mhm.
maybe by giving them access to phones or helping them communicate.
So it's not just about the kids, it's about the adults too.
Absolutely. It's about the whole school community and
Yeah.
reminding everyone to look out for each other to support their friends and colleagues.
It's about that sense of community that you were talking about earlier.
Right, exactly. That's so important in times of crisis.
So it's not just about what happens right after the event. What about the days and weeks that follow? What else does the research emphasize?
Follow up is really, really important. Schools need to have ways to check in with students and staff and use screening tools to figure out who might be at higher risk for developing problems like PTSD.
So like a system for monitoring how people are doing.
Yeah, exactly. So they can catch things early on and refer people to mental health professionals if they need more help. It's also really important to train school staff to recognize the signs of distress in students so they can get them the help they need.
Okay, that makes sense. And for those students who do develop PTSD, what does the research say about what actually works to help them get better?
So the research is really clear on this one. CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, it's been shown to be really effective for kids and teens who develop PTSD after trauma.
So both individual and group CBT can help.
Yeah, both have been shown to work. And the U.S. Task Force on Community Preventive Services, they actually recommend that organizations like schools make sure that people who have been through trauma have access to CBT because it's an evidence-based approach. And there's also this specific version of CBT called CBIT, which stands for Cognitive Behavioral Intervention for Trauma in Schools.
Mhm.
And it's been specifically designed and tested with kids. And it's been shown to be really helpful.
So it seems like what we're talking about is moving away from that one-size-fits-all approach.
Hmm.
The immediate debriefing for everyone, which we've seen, doesn't really have the evidence to support it
Right.
and might even do more harm than good. And instead, we're moving towards a more tailored system, like focusing on creating a supporting environment for everyone, figuring out who might be at higher risk, and then offering evidence-based treatments like CBT to those who need it.
That's exactly it. It's about being more targeted and using what we know works instead of just relying on what we've always done.
So I think we can all agree that this has been a super helpful conversation. It's really highlighted how important it is to look at the research, especially when we're talking about something as important as how we support young people in schools after a crisis.
Absolutely.
And it makes you wonder, right? All those resources that have been poured into these debriefing programs, maybe they could be better used to implement things like psychological first aid
Mm-hmm.
and make sure kids have access to CBT if they need it.
Right. It's definitely something to think about.
So to you, our listener, who brought us this research, we hope this deep dive has given you a much clearer understanding of what the evidence says about psychological debriefing and these other interventions in schools. It seems like the research is raising some really big questions about whether they should be used so routinely, and it's pointing us towards different approaches, like psychological first aid and CBT, that might be more effective and safer for kids.
Absolutely. And I think what's really striking here is how these early intervention models became so widespread, even though there wasn't much evidence to back them up, and even with some signs they could be harmful. It's a good reminder that we always need to be questioning our practices, especially in places like schools where kids are involved, and making sure we're using the best, most up-to-date information to guide what we do.
Such an important point. We can't just keep doing things the way they've always been done. We have to keep learning and evolving as new research comes out.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We encourage you to keep exploring these alternative approaches. like psychological first aid and CBT, and to really think critically about how schools and communities can respond most effectively in times of crisis.
Yes, and to keep learning and questioning and always putting the well-being of young people first.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much for joining us.